All right. So Ilene Smith. Ilene Smith. Oh my gosh. I'm sorry about that. It's so great to have you on. Oh my gosh. I'm so excited to get chatting about this. I know this, as we did mention, this is pretty much a perfect time to have this conversation because I think a lot of people could really relate to this message. As I mentioned, I think so the topic, of course, is trauma, which is probably the least favorite topic anybody could have with somebody, but it is something we all I think could relate to, and there's different degrees of trauma, but we'll go into that of what it looks like. But I just want to welcome you and thank you for being on Passion Love Pursuit podcast.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here and to be able to have this conversation with you because everything you're saying is so true. Like we are all impacted by trauma on some level. It's just really a matter of to what degree.
Yeah, exactly. Well, so if you could first tell me a little bit of your background and how you got so passionate about talking about such a hard subject, which is trauma.
Well, it's a good question. So I personally, I'd spent probably, let's say, probably about 15 years in talk therapy myself. And in my early 40s, I decided to go back to school to get a master's in mental health counseling. And so being in therapy myself, then I start this master's in mental health counseling, and I'm doing my internship at an eating disorder clinic. And I'm starting to learn a lot more about trauma resolution and how the body is impacted by trauma. And my supervisor was trained in somatic experiencing. And so that's where my interest really started in it. And I didn't even know what I was getting myself into, but I found myself going to the first training and, being in talk therapy myself, I still felt in my early 40s, as much work as I had done and all the yoga and all the things that I've tried to do to regulate my nervous system, I felt like it was more of a management issue than a lifestyle. And when I got to the first somatic experiencing training and I started really beginning to understand that trauma is really this energy that gets locked in our body around real or perceived threat, I felt like that was the missing link. Like we really do have to bring the body into the healing process. And so that was the beginning of it. As a student of the work, I also became a patient. And very quickly, I'd say probably within the first 6 months, I could not believe how much more regulated my own nervous system was starting. My nervous system really started to settle down. And, it was from there, it just kind of snowballed for me. I started using somatic experiencing and more body-based therapies with my clients. And I had many clients that had been through so much treatment, a lot of addiction treatment. I worked in an eating disorder clinic, so I was seeing just great results. And I felt at a certain point, as I was educating my clients through the process, I felt like there's just so much misinformation out there about how we need to heal and about trauma. And I felt that was kind of the impetus for the book.
Well, let's go into this. What is somatic experiencing? Because I never heard of it before you, to be honest. So I would love to know what it is and what does it look like? I know you talk about it's bringing the body into therapy and the mind-body connection. So what is it?
So yeah, it's actually pretty hard to explain, but I will do my best. So if you think about this one idea, and the founder of Somatic Experiencing is a man named Peter Levine, and he has like 2 PhDs, and he started studying animals in the wild, and he was trying to figure out why animals in the wild don't get traumatized and why humans do. And what he ultimately figured out is that animals have this biological completion where they shake the trauma off and then they move on. And right, if you ever watch animals, like if they shake their bodies and they keep going. Even our domestic animals do this. And so he started down this path of like, well, people need this biological completion to reset their nervous system as well. So the idea of somatic experience is that you're working with the body and its natural impulsive instincts to move and deal with sensory experiences. And by doing so, that's how the trauma gets integrated and renegotiated into the body. So if you think about trauma as something that happens too much, too soon, too fast with any ability to defend yourself. So we have to then work. So now that you have a body, let's say you have a body that's been traumatized, that body is not a body that's going to feel safe. So the work in somatic experience is to help build the body as a safe container so that you can move through your sensory experiences with a sense of mastery. So let's say somebody got into a car accident, right? And they didn't have time to defend themselves, right? Too much, too soon, too fast, without any way to defend yourself. So in a somatic experiencing session, you might work through that accident by getting the person to a place of actually physically sharing and showing in the session how they would have defended themselves if they could. And often that will evoke emotion, and it'll evoke spontaneous movement, which also often leads to heat, shaking, and tears, which is how we release trauma from the body. So that person then gets to move through that experience with a sense of mastery.
That's so intriguing.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, I've seen some really amazing things happen for people in sessions.
So does that mean with any traumatic experience, you could have them visualize how they react to that if they had the ability to?
Yeah, I mean, you'll walk, like we use channels like sensation, imagery, behavior, affect, and meaning in somatic experiencing. So any one of those channels will help us get to that place of helping the person find some biological completion with the experience.
Do you also do breath work with this experiencing?
Breath work, I wouldn't say is specific to SE, but like they'll often, you might wind up working with the breath in the sense of noticing how you're breathing, notice what it feels like to breathe deeper or more shallow, depending upon where what's happening with that person's system. But the big idea is that you're really working in somatic experiencing with what we call a bottom-up approach. You're working with the more primitive instincts in the body rather than what we consider top-down in most therapeutic talk therapy processes. So you're working with the most primitive part of the brain, which is what we call the reptilian brain. And the reptilian brain only knows survival. And so the language of survival is sensation. It doesn't know anything verbal. It's all pre-verbal. So you're really working with the body's sensory experiences to help regulate the nervous system, because it's all attached to how your autonomic nervous system is functioning.
Wow. And then the verse of that is top down, you said?
Top down, which is, our highest level cognitive process, right? When you go to talk therapy, right, it's all about trying to understand why and all the insight into how you wound up where you are today. And I'm not saying that one is better than the other. I actually think they work beautifully together as long as the talk therapy doesn't keep re-traumatizing the person. Because I know a lot of people that do go to talk therapy and they spend years and years retelling their story rather than creating a new and healthier relationship with their past. And yes, we all need an empathic witness to our experiences and our stories. But in the somatic work, you really do get to develop a new and healthier relationship with your past.
I love that, because I relate to that talk therapy. I remember when I was with a psychologist years and years ago, one thing I hate is like retelling the story of like what it stemmed from. And then they would have me go to my childhood and all these things. And I do believe there's a benefit to that, but it is also as well draining, that because for somebody like myself, I want the tools to change. I want to, move into the positive and put the negative behind me, or be able to heal it, So what I like that you talk about, that I'm intrigued by, is this is a way to heal trauma opposed to just suppressing trauma. So can we talk about that? Because you did mention you've been doing talk therapy for quite a while now. So why is talk therapy not as beneficial? Well, I mean, you're kind of explaining this, but
yeah, I can go one level
yes,
deeper. Yeah, absolutely. So in talk therapy, we're working with our highest brain functioning, which is our cognition. But our bodies don't lie. Our bodies will always, like, we can't override that trauma energy we can't reason away that trauma energy that gets locked in the body. We have to have some sense of mastery over our experiences and some sort of biological completion and spontaneous movement and some ability to go back into the trauma and be able to defend ourselves when we couldn't defend ourselves, or bring our bodies out of a free state, right? Like, so if fight, flight, and freeze are our survival instincts. If fight or flight doesn't work, what does our body do? It shuts down. So a lot of times we see people that don't even, this is actually kind of fascinating. You have people that are like, especially people that have had chronic stress during their childhood, which is what they call complex PTSD. And in order for them to survive, they've had to shut down totally, right? So like, that person might look really dissociated. We often think of that person as like the totally chill, mellow person, but that person is just disconnected. And we have to then kind of reverse engineer those survival instincts. You can't talk your way out of it. It has to actually be a physical experience that is going to bring the person out of a freeze. So I see this a lot. Like, if I've had many dissociated clients that are sitting in that freeze. And what's fascinating as we start reverse engineering and we bring them out of their freeze, their fight and flight instincts start kicking up. And then eventually what it does is it allows for all that energy to start getting discharged from the body.
Wow.
But that energy has to get discharged from the body in order for us to have more holistic and organic healing.
Yeah. And how do we even decipher that we have this energy trapped inside of us from unhealed trauma?
Well, I think that one of the things that that I see as a clinician with people that have a lot of trauma is they often come to me and say, like, life doesn't feel right. Even though I know I don't want to behave that way, or I'm using maladaptive behaviors, I don't understand. It's almost like my body just goes there and I just do it, or I'm reactive. And so, right, it gives me an opportunity to start explaining that, okay, this is what you're seeing might be developmental trauma that happened before anything verbal. It could be birth trauma. It could be all the stress throughout your childhood. It could be, a big accident that you have, right? It can be a million different things, but it's generally, if your life doesn't feel joyful, if you don't feel fully connected, maybe you see people as dangerous, or they're, like, I hear a lot of people with trauma say, oh, it's so exhausting being around people. And, it's so that what they're really telling me is, like, I can't fully connect, that there's a discomfort in my system that's not allowing me to fully connect with myself and the world around me. And so, like, I would say, top thing is that someone doesn't feel that like they're living their life joyfully. Someone that's sitting in chronic anxiety, using maladaptive behaviors. Those are all signs that there's trauma that needs to be repaired in the system. And one of the things that I've done in my book is I developed a series of 6 assessments for the reader to take. And the first one is what I call a trauma sensitivity assessment. So it's to see not how traumatized you are, because I hate that. I mean, I think that's just labeling, but how your past trauma experiences are still impacting your life today. And when people, and so it's more about looking at how everyday ordinary experiences that people aren't even aware are linked to their trauma.
You know what, touching on that, I realize I have certain triggers that I didn't realize were still in me.
Oh, how interesting.
and noticing, being aware of my triggers. I know what they're stemming from is certain trauma I had. And I never thought to label it as trauma, but, you know, I think it's okay to say that because I don't think it's a bad word. But do you think that all bad experiences lead to trauma, or is it just some, like, would you say trauma is kind of the word that defines it as deep wounding, or how do you tell the
No,
difference
it's a good question. It's
bad
a really good
experiences or
question.
trauma?
So I think let's build a different kind of framework to look at it. So trauma is not about the event. It's about that energy that gets locked in the body around real or perceived threat. So 10 people can have the same experience, and there can be 10 different reactions to that experience. So the question is why? So, you know, biopsychosocial, so biology, right? We're all born in with a certain level of resilience and tolerance in our nervous system. Obviously, environmental factors, and, you know, and emotionally how we're kind of, you know, how we're built, and what happens along the way in our environments. So all of those things play into whether you're going to get traumatized by an experience. Also, how soon and how quickly in the aftermath of the experience you find safety, like another safe person, or you get support. Like, you know, I could talk about myself in this example, right? Like, so my husband died just about 4 years ago, and you know, I think there's a couple of things I can unpack here, but the point I'm trying to make about this is I had so much support and so much safety surrounding me and so much love that the experience, and he died very suddenly. The experience could have been a lot more traumatic had I not had a good support system. Now, let's back up one step further. When my husband died, I had been doing a lot of somatic experiencing, you know, patient work. And so for the first time in my life, I actually allowed people to support me. And I allowed my body to move through all of the intense emotions that I felt along the way. Rather than, I have a history of eating disorders, rather than going into eating disorder behavior, I like every time that, you know, it would just come in waves, and I allowed for my body to move through it. And that had everything to do with the fact that my body at this point had a lot more resilience because I had worked through so much of the trauma pieces. And a big part of my trauma pieces, like I had, you know, attachment issues and abandonment issues. So like, what the irony of this happening, right? Like everything sort of showing up. And I was shocked at how well I was able to move through everything. And I know that it had so much to do with all the somatic work that I had done.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. Well, I'm curious, what happens in our body when we feel trauma? What specifically happens that gets locked in our body, that energy?
God, it's just, it's like, it's almost like, we lose our sense of safety would be the best way to describe it. And I can give you an example. Like, so I have a friend, we'll call him Jack. Jack, in his early 20s, he was driving home late one night from his girlfriend's house, and it happened to be prom night. And he was driving under a elevated train tracks, you know, where there's like cement pillars that the train tracks are being held up by. And a car drives by him. He's under the elevated train. Car drives by him, sideswipes him, loses control, and the car smashes into a cement pillar, and there's 8 kids like splattered all over the road. One of the kids is under his tire. Okay. Wow. Okay. So now it's not his fault, but because he's he was a complicit part of the accident. He has to stay there and watch the cleanup of the accident.
Mm.
And so now fast forward, Jack passes the bar exam, he gets married, he has 2 children, and everything in his life, he senses danger when danger is not present at any given moment. Like, I mean, I'll give you like a couple of like funny examples. They're funny because but it's sad. He wouldn't let his kids eat sushi. Anytime one of the kids got in a car with someone else, you can see like the anxiety would just rise. The way he drives a car is very hyper vigilant. Everyone on the road is like dangerous and out to get him. And like last summer we were out on Long Island having dinner, sitting outside, and I guess there was like a case of West Nile virus a couple weeks earlier, like 1 case of West Nile virus on Long Island, and he is like spraying us down with the bug spray. So here's a guy who never dealt with his trauma, and he sees everything in the world as dangerous. So that's an example how it might get locked in the body. Another example would be, like a war veteran who comes home and doesn't deal with, an experience that they've had in war, and everything, they start getting, their systems are agitated, and they get abusive to their wives, and the kids are playing and making noise and they freak out. So it shows up in so many different ways, but
absolutely,
ultimately it's either, danger, sensing a lot of danger, or it might be maladaptive behaviors just because the nervous system can't tolerate the discomfort.
Actually, let's talk about this discomfort, because I think a lot of people don't want to revisit that trauma. So how do you safely do it so people could actually heal that wound or heal that trauma so they can move forward
through it,
living
so
out life?
It's a good question. And in talk therapy, what do we do, right? We go back in there, we keep reliving it. In cognitive behavior therapy, right, it's like trying to change your thinking so your behaviors will change. In somatic experiencing, it looks nothing like that. The process is so much more organic. And so in the sessions, someone might, the patient might come in and say, okay, well, I want to work on this today. And it's not like, well, tell me what happened then when you were 4 and you were abused. It's more like, what do you notice? I might say something to the client like, well, what are you noticing even as you're thinking about talking about this? And so then we start working more with the body sensations. Or I might say, what is it that you remember from the situation that you're noticing right now, or that you're remembering right now? So we'll walk through it, but it's not the therapist pushing and asking and probing into the situation. It's allowing the client to really let the body guide the process. So, so it's much more organic. I mean, a lot of times in a somatic experiencing session, clients things will just show up, and we don't even know how that happens. Like, I can think of just even one session for myself, like when I was working through the grief process of my husband, and I got on the somatic experiencing therapist touch table, because there's touch work that we do with somatic experiencing, and she had like one of those noise machines in the background, and I was like, and all of a sudden a memory came up for me, and this had been like 2 years after my husband died, and I couldn't even look at pictures. I had such a hard time even going into the positive, really wonderful memories. It was too painful. And I got on the table, and all of a sudden a memory came up, and the tears came up, and I spent the next 45 minutes just releasing the tears and letting it just flow. And I finished the session, and I just looked at her and I said, wow, that wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. And since then I've been able to look at pictures, and I can go back into the memories, and I can share stories. And it was just like I needed that biological completion in a safe environment.
Oh, that's amazing. How releasing. That sounds like you just released it.
Yeah. And it just came up. Like, I had no idea when I got on the table that that's what was going to happen. And that's the cool part about the work.
I love that. And I know you talk in your book, you talk specifically about going through certain types of trauma, such as chronic pain, depression, anxiety. Can you go into that a little bit? Why you separated in the book, talking how to treat specifically those type of things?
Well, I felt like one of the things when I was writing the book, I felt like I really needed to give case studies and examples because because the work is it's hard to really understand what the work is without looking at the case studies. So what I did was I gave I think I use eating disorders in there. I talk about anxiety, and I go down a whole bunch of different issues because it is so effective for so many different mental health issues. Like, I think the story that I tell in the book about anxieties, I had a young girl, she's probably about 18, 19, come to my office, and she just said, and she looked at me and she said, I cannot deal with this anxiety. She's like, I am so anxious. I feel like I'm going to have a nervous breakdown. I never asked her what caused it, what triggered it, nothing. I said, well, how do you know you feel anxious? And so, right, that's the first thing. Like, I feel my stomach, I feel this. I said, if you could do anything with the anxiety, what would you want to do? And she said, I just want to curl up in a ball and die. And I said, well, let's get you curled up in a ball, because that's her body telling us, this is what I need to do. I need to get into my little cocoon. I need to be in that fetal position. I need to hold myself. And so for the next hour, I just bunkered her in with pillows and blankets, and just I had my hand on her adrenal and kidneys, just because that's where we do a lot of regulation. Mm-hmm. And she just shook for the next hour, and all that energy just started discharging from her body. Wow. And yeah, and so, right, it's a different way of dealing with the anxiety. Let's work with it. Let's see if you can move through it and know that you're going to be okay. You're not going to die from the experience. And that's a lot of the work that we do in SE is to be able to help build that resilience in the body so that somebody can move through their experiences and have a sense of mastery.
Oh, wow. That's so amazing. So I know that, or I think you touched on this about the correlation between mental health and trauma, and that a lot of it stems from actually, or mental health problems stem from trauma.
Unresolved trauma. I believe that the majority of mental health issues are just unresolved trauma locked in the body. And because remember, trauma is when there's also the physiology of it. It's stress. Okay, and what does stress do to your body? It chemically changes us. So even like if you look at the statistics on like schizophrenia and like, really chemically altered mental health issues or depression or any of these things, generally the people that wind up with these issues scored higher on the ACE studies, and I'll explain what those are. Do you know anything about the ACE studies?
No.
So the ACE studies were like, I don't know when they started them, but ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And the higher a person scores on the ACE test, it's like 10 questions, the more likely they are to have they have more mental health issues. This has been surveyed, this has been, I think, probably 20 or 30,000 people that they've polled. And so it's very telling. So they tend to have more mental health issues and more physical issues, more autoimmune things, which we know are all related to stress. So I believe that that a good percentage of mental health issues is that unresolved trauma.
When did somatic experiencing, when did this practice begin? Is it more recent, or how long has this been in practice?
It's a good question, and I don't know the answer. I know Peter, I think the Institute's been around for probably about 20 years, but I think it's just becoming more popular now as we're moving into an era that people are really recognizing the body-mind connection and the impact on it. And I think because of all the neurobiology and all of, the technology is so much greater, that we'll be able to also look at the brain scans and brain chemistry a lot more closely than we ever have before. And I think there's a lot more studies that are being done on the mind-body connection. So I think it's bringing attention to body-based therapies.
Hmm. So since we're in a virtual world right now, is it something that we could do? Because I know you have your book, which is coming out May 5th, super soon. It will probably be out by the time this episode comes out, but moving beyond trauma. It's called The Roadmap to Healing from Your Past and Living with Ease and Vitality. So can somebody take your book and actually work through the process themselves, or is it something you have to do in person with somebody like yourself?
And that's a really good question. So I set the book up as a way for the reader to actually start their own somatic healing process. And so in the book, what I do is I talk about my own personal journey. I explain the different types of trauma. I explain how trauma energy gets locked in the body. And then I set up these assessments. And what the assessments are, they're ways for the reader to start piecing together how their own nervous system is functioning. So like one of the assessments is measuring whether you're fight, flight, or freeze dominant. Or where you score really high on those scales. Or another one is, do you err more towards rigidity in your life or fragmentation, right? Like when you go to do a task. And then there's other things like how you're sensing yourself internally, which is something called interoception. And when we've had a lot of trauma, we tend to score really low on interoception or really high. So like that person that says, oh, I have a really high pain tolerance. It's like, well, you don't even know if you're bleeding, is a person that generally doesn't have an accurate sense of their internal sensation. So I go through, so the reader gets to map out their own nervous system. And then I have about 9 or 10 corresponding exercises that the reader can start playing around with. And those exercises are all designed to help you start creating some sort of body-mind connection in a very gentle way. So there's breath work in the book. There's I have another exercise where you're working with your senses and you're building what I call a sensory toolbox. So different things to try to bridge that gap between the mind-body connection. So I think that the book can be a really good starting point for someone. And maybe it's enough for a person. And maybe there's, I think that the somatic experience is a great way to excel that process. And now there's practitioners all over the world now.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
What was I going to ask you? Sorry. Oh, yes. At the end of the book, you talk about how to move forward into a healthy lifestyle. So can you talk a little bit about that? So once you do, let's say you feel that you've somewhat healed your trauma, now moving into continuing that and living a healthy life, you included that at the end. So I'd love if you could speak about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I call it a healing lifestyle. Because, right, healthy lifestyle, right, we know what that looks like. And sometimes a healthy lifestyle is somebody trying to overcompensate, and it gets into a lot of rigidity. So a healing lifestyle is really about finding a deeper connection with yourself and finding the things to keep in your day-to-day life that are going to help regulate your nervous system. So, right, a healthy lifestyle is more about our physical, health. This is really, a healing lifestyle is really about the healing that we do for our emotional health and how we can nurture our nervous system to keep it in balance. And it's different for everyone. And what I'm trying to do in the book through the exercises is spark curiosity about a healing lifestyle, because by sparking curiosity, we're going to start bridging that gap in the relationship that you have in yourself and that connectivity, because that's what ultimately I'm really encouraging the reader to do, is to find connectivity within themselves. Because once we can connect to ourselves, right, we can connect to the world very differently on a much deeper level.
I absolutely love that.
Yeah.
And see, like I said, I've been mind blown this whole period of COVID-19 with all of the learning I'm going through. So I'm like getting blanks right now. Sorry.
No, it's all good. But I think it's also a time where right now on some level, like, and I'm noticing this like with everybody around me, I think we're really disoriented. I think this is a traumatic event, right? Too much, too soon, too fast, without any way to defend yourself, and all of the uncertainty. And I think it's, and we can't go out. So we're beginning to feel disoriented, and there's a lot of agitation and discomfort in people's systems, and we're all trying to manage it differently. But I think it's a disorienting time on some level.
True. And actually, can you touch on that? Because since some people might be highly affected by what's going on right now, I think your book is a great tool to help during this time before it deepens to a deeper wound, if you want to say, right? So I think with this time going on, it could be quite traumatic for somebody. So what can you recommend most for somebody right now that might feel really hit hard by this?
Well, I think there's a couple of things, and it's funny. I wrote an article that was published on Psych Central on how to navigate the coronavirus, and some of the things that I talk about in there are, for starters, like sitting in front of the news all day is not a good plan. It's totally disorienting, and so my recommendation is, find a good news source. Give yourself 2 or 3 times a day to check in with it. I think anything that's going to bring you into connection with your body, whether it's getting on a yoga mat for 10 minutes, whether it's lying down and doing breath work, whether it may be using a foam roller, getting out for a walk, anything that's going to create more connectivity with your body is going to be valuable. I think another big piece, and this is like, connection is part of our survival, is staying connected with people. And I know, and I'm experiencing this myself, it's getting harder and harder. Like, you start feeling like, oh, I don't want to deal with another Zoom thing, or like, I don't like, but I think we have to white knuckle it right now. Even if you don't feel like staying connected, you got to make the effort to stay connected. I think it's extremely valuable. Another thing I think it's really important if you have children is to be able to talk to them, make them feel safe, and help them understand what we're experiencing without scaring them.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important for parents to try to stay as regulated as possible so that your kids don't get totally dysregulated.
Yeah, absolutely. This is such a powerful conversation, and it's such a powerful topic that I don't think that we could even knock out like all the tools you need to heal yourself from trauma. I mean, I think it's a whole experience in itself, but this gives so much valuable resources of tools we could use, and also a different perspective on bringing our mind body connection together. And that's why meditation is so powerful, breath work is so powerful, is because you're connecting your body to your mind, and that's where the synergy happens. So
absolutely.
Yeah, this is so great. Is there anything else you want to share that's so valuable that we need to hear around trauma?
Well, I would just say this, right? Like, that I'm not suggesting that someone who's never done, who's going in the middle of the COVID crisis and who's freaking out, I'm not suggesting you go into your room and close the door and try to meditate or breathe for an hour. I think that we have to start somewhere. And so this means just take 10 minutes a day to create that connection with yourself, because 10 minutes a day, 10 minutes every day. Like, I calculated this a couple of weeks ago. I don't know why. I think it was for an article. 10 minutes a day for 365 days a year adds up to like 25 or 30 hours of self-care. And so 25 or 30 hours of self-care is going to make a big difference on your nervous system.
Absolutely. Yes. I know the little things, small little steps to improve
Mhm.
our mindset and our bodies and our health. Absolutely. Well, in closure, I ask all my guests, first of all, what does a passionate, purposeful life look like to you?
What a great question. Um, for me, it's about joy, connection, and doing the things that make me feel like I have expansion and creativity in my life.
Oh, I love that word. Expansion is like one of my most favorite words.
Yeah.
And then also, I mean, I asked the question, the biggest piece of advice you would share with somebody, if you could put a stamp of approval of advice you want to share to the world, what would it be?
Connection is your lifeline. Connection is oxygen.
Mm.
And even if you don't feel like connecting, find safe people to connect with because it will change your life.
Ooh, I love that. And it
Thank
changed
you.
yours, it sounds like, as
Yeah.
well through your journey. And
Oh,
where can
absolutely.
people best find you?
So my Instagram is Ilene Smith Trauma Healing. My website is ilenesmith.com, and Ilene is spelled Ilene.
Awesome. And everybody go get her book. Go check it out. It's called Moving Beyond Trauma, and it comes out May 5th. And thank you so much. I appreciate your time and, showing up yourself during this time and giving people the tools to move through this with
Um,
care and love and connection.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me.
Of course.